It is my pleasure this afternoon to introduce General Charles Q. Brown, Jr. General Brown was commissioned in 1984 as a distinguished graduate of the ROTC program at Texas Tech University. General Brown has undeniably embraced his alma mater school motto, which is, "From here, it's possible." General Brown has expanded his plane of possibility throughout his Air Force career. His notable tours include aide-de-camp to the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, Director of Secretary of the Air Force, and Chief Staff Executive Action Group, and Deputy Director Operation U.S. Central Command. General Brown has commanded a fighter squadron, the U.S. Air Force Weapons School, and 2 fighter wings. And prior to his current assignment, he served as commander of U.S. Air Force's Central Command. General Brown is commanding pilot with 2,900 flying hours, including 120 combat hours. General Brown has proven throughout his life and Air Force career that possibilities are meant to be maximized. And however, what I appreciate about him the most is his willingness to convert those possibilities he received into opportunities to develop future leaders. So class of CY17, would you stand with me to welcome to the stage a highly regarded Air Force leader, Lieutenant Charles Q. Brown, Jr., Deputy Commander, Lieutenant General.
Thank you. Hey, carry on. Take your seats, please. How's everybody doing today? Good. Hey, it's a real pleasure to be here with you today. I was reflecting before I came here that it was 20 years ago this year that I used to sleep right over in that section during different presentations. But my goal today is hopefully to keep you awake and really to take some of your questions. What I'm going to present to you today is kind of our mission brief from CENTCOM. And I think I'm somewhat qualified to do this, partly because I've spent a lot of time in CENTCOM, either at the headquarters or as one of the components. So I've had 3 tours at the CENTCOM headquarters. One as a major, right after coming out of ACSC, working in the J3. I was a deputy J3 after wing command at Aviano. From there, I went to be the deputy air component commander for CENTCOM as a DCFAC at LUD. And then last year, I was a CFAC. The goal was to do a 2-year tour as a CFAC. That didn't work out according to my plan. I got pulled out a year early, and now serving as a deputy commander since July. And so quite a bit of experience in the region and in the AOR and for CENTCOM, having worked directly underneath the leadership of 4 different Central Command commanders. So what I want to do today is get through this. I'm going to take your questions, and I'll be able to talk about whatever you want. At the end, I got one slide. I'll talk a little about leadership I'll share with you. And I'm looking forward to getting through the slides so I can take your questions. So within CENTCOM, it's really it's an important, very rich region, and a region that's got a bit of complexity associated with it. It's geographically small, so when you look at all the other combatant commands within the United States, Department of Defense, we have the smallest number of countries. So we only have 20 countries we're dealing with, where other countries, other combatant commands have a much broader aspect to deal with. It's also important because it's kind of the cradle of civilization. And also tied to that is just the dynamics that play within our region, inside those 20 countries. 530 million people, 3 of the major religions are either in our AOR or touch our AOR. And there's 18 major languages and 22 different ethnic groups that are there. It's also resource rich. Number of petroleum assets that come from that area, whether it's petroleum or natural gas, that are in the region, and really 40 to 50% of the world's reserves are in that region. It also has 3 major choke points: the Strait of Hormuz, the Bab el-Mandeb off the Arabian Peninsula, and the Suez Canal. There's also the drivers of instability. Sectarianism is probably one of the biggest things that drives some of the conflicts that we have within our region. There's also different political environments that we're having to deal with, and somewhat dynamic with the region as well. And then as we look at the activities that we're going on, particularly as you look at operations in Afghanistan and our operations in Iraq and Syria, is dealing with the internally displaced persons as well as refugee situation as well. Not so much a military task, but military operations drive that, and the whole government approach that that we need to continue to work to make sure that as the military completes its operations, those problems and things can be addressed. We also have a number of geographic seams, and as we work our combatant command, we work very closely with UCOM and AFRICOM. On the Horn of Africa, as a matter of fact, the Horn of Africa used to be part of Central Command until AFRICOM stood up, but we work very closely with the AFRICOM, particularly as you work counterterrorism operations in Somalia and into Yemen, since we have operations and assets that are based in Djibouti in the Horn of Africa. We work very closely with UCOM for a couple purposes. One, Israel is not in our AOR, but Israel is very concerned about some of the countries that are in our AOR. And so that dialogue is pretty important between us, UCOM, and Israel. And the other is Turkey. Turkey, again, is not in our AOR, but Turkey is a part of the coalition for the counter-ISIL campaign. It's a NATO ally, and we have assets that are based in Turkey to support Operation Inherent Resolve that are OPCON to Central Command, but getting support from UCOM in those operations. And so from that, I have a pretty healthy dialogue with AFRICOM Deputy Commander and the UCOM Deputy Commander, both who I've known and served with in the past, to work through some of those seam issues. Also kind of tied to those seams is the competition for influence within the region. It's not just what the U.S. is doing in the region, but it's also what our coalition. And the coalition we have that's built within CENTCOM, it's just not for Operation Inherent Resolve. It's also for what we do in Afghanistan. So we have actually 52 nations that are represented within our headquarters. We have a facility across the street from the main headquarters where all those senior officers reside. And it's as small as one person from a country up to 10 to 12 to 13 that are there in Tampa with us and work with us on a day-to-day basis. The other part of the influence is other actors that are in our AOR that don't necessarily reside in our AOR or the CENTCOM AOR. Probably the most recent and one I had to experience up close and personal as a CFAC is Russia. Back 30 September a year ago is when Russia came into and started flying in Syria in support of the Assad regime. So they have influence in the region, expanding influence, not just in Syria, but around the AOR, and then China as well is another, particularly starting in Pakistan, and they've actually just laid down some money for access into Djibouti. So it's something that we're paying attention to as well because they have an influence. And the other probably big elephant in the room is Iran. And I can talk more about that in the Q&A, but the JICPOA actually addressed the nuclear program, but it doesn't address everything that Iran does within the region through different proxies. There's also various threats and conflict. We work through the violent extremist organizations, not just the ISIL, which you probably hear quite a bit about, but Al-Qaeda in Syria, and that's where Al-Qaeda sits right now, or on Nusra front. They kind of wear both hats, and two different membership cards sometimes on how they operate and how they apply. But the ISIL operation we're doing, and not just in Iraq and Syria, but trans-regionally. And so ISIL has a number of branches, not only in Iraq and Syria, but also in Saudi Arabia, in the Sinai, in Libya, and in Afghanistan. And so we're paying attention to that as well as the Al-Qaeda on the Arabian Peninsula in Yemen, which is a severe threat to the homeland, and we pay constant attention to. On top of that, there's a number of designated terrorist organizations, particularly in the Afghanistan, Pakistan area, that we do pay attention to from a counterterrorism standpoint. I talked about Iran a little bit earlier, but they want to have influence in the region, regional influence. And from Iran's perspective, they don't necessarily do it themselves. They work through a number of proxies. And whether it's the Houthis in Yemen is one of the proxies they work through, Lebanese Hezbollah in Syria and Lebanon, Hamas in Lebanon or the Gaza Strip, or the Shia militia groups that are internal to Iraq. They're pushing to have influence, and that's how Iran kind of does business. I will tell you, from my perspective, the JICPOA addressed the nuclear part of their regional hegemony that they're looking for, but it has not addressed all the other things they've been doing in the background. And they've been, I would say, in some estimations, a bit untouched and undeterred. And there's some work we have to continue to do there. And then The thing that probably takes up most of our time and most of our bandwidth is what's going on in Iraq and Syria. I'll give you a quick kind of campaign update of kind of how that's going. And having been to CFAC last year and watching Ramadi go on for 7 months, very slow, the campaign in Mosul actually is going fairly well. All the east side of Mosul has been recaptured, and the operation on the west side of the Tigris River should start here pretty soon. At the same time, the other key stronghold for ISIL is Raqqa in Syria. And the isolation of Raqqa has already started. It's been about 60 days since that started, and that's done with the Syrian Democratic Force. So it's kind of a buy with them through indigenous partners on the ground there. And that part's going fairly well. So I'd say we're closer to the end than we were to the beginning, but I don't think ISIL will completely ever go away, okay? And it'll be ISIL 2.0. Matter of fact, ISIL came from Al-Qaeda Iraq. And so we're going to have to continue to put pressure on them and maintain the coalition as we move forward. And then Yemen. When we look at Yemen, there is a bit of a civil war there. There's also the Houthis that I've talked about being supported by the Iranians in some regard with some capability and capacity. But it's also the Saudi-led coalition against the Houthis. And depending on what you read, you may have a perspective of how that's going. The fact that the Saudis have led a coalition, to me, is actually somewhat monumental, partly because working in the region over time, it's always been difficult to get the GCC nations to work together. And this is a case where they're actually working together and having an effect there and actually learning some things about themselves and how they operate. And we're learning some things as well. But it does continue to put pressure there, and really, because we're concerned about the influence that happens through the Iranians to the Bab el-Mandeb. And if you recall, back in October, there were several TLAM shot at some radar sites. That was based on somebody. I don't know if it was the Houthis, but we know for sure the equipment was Iranian that took shots and attacked not only U.S. ships, but also some of our partnerships. And so it's a key thing that we're concerned about there in Yemen, in addition to the AQAP. And then Afghanistan. Operation in Afghanistan continue. So our force management level went down from 9,800 down to 8,400 back in December. There's a two-part piece to this. It's the counterterrorism, but it's also the development of the Afghan National Defense Force. And when you look at the campaign overall, the Taliban really, their goal was to regain one of the district centers over the course of the past year, and that did not happen. So some success from that perspective. As an airman, the one thing I will tell you that I did notice is that we've actually, the other part of our mission set is actually to advise and assist with the Afghan forces. And our TAC Air, or the 438th Air Expeditionary Wing that does the training for the Afghan Air Force, has done a pretty effective job bringing in C-130, MD-530, and the A-29. Matter of fact, I was in Afghanistan April of last year when the A-29s flew their first combat sortie. And the first time they ever had a chance to drop live was in combat. Very well done. And so they're actually doing some pretty good work there, and we'll continue to work with them there in Afghanistan. Next slide. So this is the CENTCOM vision. I think the one key point I want to highlight here is that our goal is to have a stable and prosperous region. It's going to require some governance and improved security. And I realize that's somewhat aspirational. And if you spend any time working at CENTCOM, we may touch that for like 30 seconds one day, and then after that it's gone. And I joke about it when we talk about planning, and you try to plan in joint planning at some kind of end state. Well, in CENTCOM we don't have end states; we just have pass-through states. Where we may pass through there and reach a level of equilibrium for a little bit of time, but next thing you know, something's going to happen that we didn't expect. And that's kind of been the case, because I've been really working CENTCOM really by and large for the past 6 years. And that's just the way it is. But it doesn't mean it's not a goal. And there's opportunities there that we need to continue, but it's really how do we protect threats to our interests as a U.S., but the interests of our partners, not only the partners in the region, but partners around the world as we move forward. Next slide. And so our mission really is to direct and enable military operations in activities as we work with our allies and partners. And when we say allies, it's those that we work with on a day-to-day basis in the region, and those that come into the region, but also the interagency. And the one thing I've noted, the coalition that we have that's doing the counter-ISIL campaign, particularly on the air side, there's 19 nations, and the majority of them are NATO nations. Okay, so it's not a NATO operation, but there's a lot of NATO activity associated there. Conversely, if you look at Afghanistan, General Nicholson is dual-hatted, not only as a U.S. 4A commander, but also commander for Resolute Support, which is the NATO mission. So that is a NATO operation. So we get a little bit of both when we start looking at how we work with our allies and partners. And actually, if there's one thing that you can take away from your time here at HCSC, is the partnerships you build here with some of our international partners will pay dividends in the future. One of my classmates is the Air Chief in Oman, and another classmate is the senior international in the Qatari Armed Forces headquarters, was another one of my classmates. And it pays dividends when you go see him as a 2-star or 3-star. You can compare notes that we were, played flicker ball together or whatever we did. But the point is, it builds a relationship, so it allows us to get things done within the region. Next slide. All right, so this is the strategic approach, and this strategic approach is something that General Votel put together as he came into command. As a matter of fact, he was working on this before I got there. He took command in March, so I got to work for him for about 3 months as the air component commander, and then came in as a deputy commander. He finishes this up as I came in, and so it's prepare, pursue, and prevail, and or 3 Ps. Prepare. Really, what he's looking to do is prepare the environment. We want to be ready to do things ahead of crisis. And so a lot of that takes time and effort. And it's the relationships we build within the region. It's how we actually do intel preparation. It's how we understand the region. But it's really to be ready in case something happens. And it's also having forces in the region so we can do so. Pursue opportunities. One of his goals is not to miss an opportunity. As a matter of fact, he gives the staff and others quite a bit of leeway to look forward and do things. And he realizes that not everything's going to go perfectly, and we're going to have some aw shucks moments, but he'd rather do that than miss an opportunity. He actually, I guess, sometimes gives me a pretty free leash, where most times the deputy gets to stay home while the commander is out on the road. Well, we were both in the AOR here about 10 days ago, and he doesn't mind me going. We have pretty good connectivity that we can, comms-wise, we can communicate and get things done, but that's helpful because we can double up to catch up on certain areas while we going out and going to some places he can't get to. And so there's some real pluses there. But real goal is to seize the initiative and work with our partners as we do so. The other thing is transparency. The one thing that I found really unique about how General Votel operates, and it's something that I'm looking to embrace, and even at this level you still learn a bit about leadership. I would see it as an air component commander. He would send sometimes almost daily, every other day updates to the chairman and the SecDef on things that were going on. And I would get blind CC'd on them. And as a component commander, I was going, that's a lot of information. But what I found out, it's paid some dividends because now people understand what's going on. They understand what we're doing, and it makes it easier for them to say yes when we ask to go do something because they got the background to go with it. We don't have to go through a whole laborious briefing process to convince people what it is that needs to be done because they see it happening kind of real time. And his transparency is well appreciated, not only within the Department of Defense, but across the interagency, so there's some real pluses there. Last piece is the prevailing conflict. We got to win the current fight, okay? And we really have two of them, Afghanistan and then Iraq and Syria. And then as we plan for the next one. And don't know where that next one's going to be because I wouldn't have forecast it would be in Iraq and Syria right now, or back into Iraq and into Syria. But we got to be prepared for whatever comes next, which goes back to the first bullet there is to prepare the environment. Right? And then we got to be able to be ready to go in adversity, because there will be adversity. That's just the nature of our AOR. Next slide. All right. As far as the priorities is, one of those is to ensure an effective posture. And what do we mean by that? It goes back to the prepare point I've already made. I was over at the Air War College today, and one of the questions I had to deal with, force presence. For Central Command, we have no assigned forces. So everything we got to fight for, okay? If you're living in PACOM or UCOM, you have assigned forces that are based there that you can use on a regular basis. Well, we got to ask for everything. And that's a challenge, particularly when the services are looking at readiness and want to bring everything back. We'd like to keep some things there because we can't be responsive and you can't build trust if you're not there. Okay? So it's important that we're there with forces and so we can be responsive. So having that effective posture, not just from a force presence, but the relations we built the engagement we have, our exercise program, and all those things associated with it. We also want to strengthen our allies and partnerships. The one thing I find interesting is if you spent time in the Middle East, it is all about relationships. If you read the book, 3 Cups of Tea, I drink a lot of tea. Okay? The first meeting when you go meet with somebody the first time, do not come in there talking business. You come in and talk family, you drink tea, you just kind of talk about things, and then maybe the next meeting you can actually start talking some substance. And that's just the way it is within our region. The other thing you find is that, like for example, the Air Chief in Qatar. So I was there as a DCFAC and the CFAC. Well, he's been the Air Chief for like 8 or 9 years. We change out, commanders every 2 or 3 years. So I think that's the reason why I'm stuck in CENTCOM. So that way I keep coming back and hey, it's you again. That helps because you already have that relationship. You can get past the first cup of tea, the second cup of tea, because you've already built that relationship, and you can get some things done. And that's just the way our AOR is. We got to deter and counter state aggressors. In our AOR, Iran is probably the big elephant in the room. But at the same time, there's influence from Russia and China within the region that we got to pay attention to. But Iran's the one that we've got to pay attention to. I will tell you, in my opinion, we probably have not paid enough attention to because of the JICPOA here recently. And then the deter and counter the violent extremist organization. That's something that we do in coordination with SOCOM. And the thing I'd offer to you as well is, as we look at this, it's not just what we do. In the past, we tended to focus on kind of our regional problems. The joint staff and the chairman are looking much more trans-regionally. Because what you're finding is our adversaries, particularly in the violent extremist organizations, they don't care about country borders or COCOM UCP lines. Okay, well, they do what they need to do where they need to do it, and we got to be more responsive and have authorities to do things across different parts, not just in CENTCOM, but in other areas as well, and be able to do it very quickly. All right, next slide. All right, this is kind of how we're organized for those that haven't spent time at CENTCOM. So we have our main headquarters in Tampa, but we also have a forward headquarters on Al Udeid Air Base that we go to on a regular basis. We have our 5 component commands. 2 of them are headquartered where the 3-star headquarters is in the AOR. So for NAVCENT, Admiral Donegan sits in Bahrain, and then General Harigian is there in Qatar. If you didn't know it, we have families there. My wife was there with me, and so we have about 30 families, Air Force families in Qatar, living there in Qatar, and it's not bad living. SOCCENT is based in Tampa, but it has a forward headquarters at Al Udeid as well, and then MARCENT sits in Tampa. But we have actually access and capability that we can get to forward and have forces there forward as well. Next slide. All right, let me talk to you about kind of what's in our inbox and things that are kind of driving the fight for us right now, and hopefully that'll spur some questions. I'm getting close to the end here. First of all, is the administration transition. So, okay, today is week 1. So, a lot of unknowns. Matter of fact, the president's supposed to go over to the Pentagon today, and I suspect we'll probably get some guidance on what it is he wants and when he wants it. And one of the things that we've been doing in our headquarters is actually thinking about how do we provide an assessment of our region and advice, so we can actually help support the chairman in providing best military advice to the president. And so we spent quite a bit of time on that. General Votel put together about a 5-page paper, worked very directly with his commanders, and sent that last Thursday or so. And the SecDef has already read through it. Secretary Mattis has read through it, and we had a VTC with him on Tuesday. And you can tell that he's read through it and understands some of the things we're thinking about for our region. So that is one thing that's taken up a bit of our bandwidth. And we'll see how that plays out as we go to the future, to be able to not only take care of the counter-ISIL campaign, but everything else we got to do. On the counter-ISIL campaign, I've kind of given you already a little bit of a campaign update, but I'll tell you there's a number of dynamics that are associated here as we look longer beyond the counter-ISIL campaign. One is the coalition that's doing the operations right now. The goal is to maintain that coalition for the future, to make sure we not only security of our homeland, but the homelands of all the others that are interested in supporting the coalition. The other is kind of long-term security for Iraq and development of their forces in the future. And then the kind of the other, I would say, elephant in the room is what happens with Syria. Because our only mission right now is the counter-Daesh mission, counter-ISIL mission in Syria. I think there's got to be a discussion at some point about what happens in Syria vis-a-vis Russians, regime, Iranians, Turkey, and the Kurds. And if you look up in northeast Syria, between Aleppo and Raqqa, which is about 100 kilometers, all those nations and entities all playing in that area. And it's very complicated. And until we have a long-term vision of where we're headed with Syria, and my estimation at some point we're going to probably have to talk to the Russians about that to move it forward. Because it requires a diplomatic solution. We're not going to do it by the military. I've addressed Iran a little bit already. Of course, you expect we probably have contingency plans for Iran, but we do need to think not only from a full military campaign plan, but when you look at military operational planning, you go from phase 0 to phase 5. I wouldn't say we're in phase 0. As a matter of fact, I don't think phase 0 really exists because you're competing in the gray zone, in an area where there's a lot of things going on, and as Iran works with its proxies to influence things around the region, if we don't do anything, that influence continues to grow. And that's kind of how things happen in the Bab el-Mandeb. And the concern there is they already kind of have influence over the Strait of Hormuz, potentially have influence over the Bab el-Mandeb by supplying weapons to shut that down, the Saudi Lake Coalition. But the big scheme of things is, again, that's going to take a diplomatic solution, and the challenge there is tired doing this. They're figuring out this, and so that'll be something we pay attention to. Pakistan. I think one of the things that as we move forward, and it's just one of the things I found when I went through the region, is that as we talk to all of our different partners, they're all looking forward to the next administration and what that might portend and what opportunities they might provide. And so, everybody's looking and posturing for a better relationship in here or there. The concern with Pakistan is, one part is that a number of terrorist organizations reside in Pakistan, influence activity in Afghanistan, which is a concern. At the same time, they're a nuclear power, and they have an adversary of India, which is not an AOR. And India actually has a relationship with Afghanistan, which pisses off Pakistan. And so again, it's complicated. And so it's an area that we kind of need to pay attention to and work with, because we need Pakistan, because the airline of communication to get in Afghanistan is through Pakistan. Okay, and so it's one of those where we may not agree on things, but we do have to have a relationship. I kind of addressed Afghanistan a bit already, and kind of the big thing is to continue the course of where we are with Afghanistan, kind of long term. And then the trans-regional impacts I've kind of alluded to already. So it's the big pieces and parts of how do we actually not only as a U.S. and coalition have influence, but also counter some of the influence from Russia, Iran, and China. A couple things I want to share with you from a senior airman perspective, and I am actually the senior airman in CENTCOM, and having worked there for a period of time. But one of the things that I do want to highlight is, our chief of staff, General Goldfein, has 3 big rocks he's working towards, and one of those is the developing joint leaders and teams. And part of that is how do we do that, and how do we do it better? And I think I'm a product of that, to be honest with you, which is why I've spent so much time at CENTCOM and joint jobs and doing joint type work. And it's almost like what I've talked about in the region. If you're not there and people don't know you, you don't build that relationship, they're not going to hire you. Okay, and so working in a joint role I think is important, so you can actually. And the challenge there is you lose touch with the Air Force. So there's a lot of things going on in the Air Force I have no idea about because I'm doing joint stuff. So there's some pluses and minuses to it. But I think there's some things that we can work better on in developing that joint team. And one of those is ISR and how we do ISR. Okay, and with that I would also say ISR and full motion video are not the same thing. So when people talk about ISR, what they really mean is they want to watch TV. Okay, that's not ISR. And we as an Air Force have to do a better job of articulating how you use ISR. So not everybody has FMD. Okay, The second part of that is for us to be able to go and do deliberate targeting and strike at the heart of Daesh or anybody else, we got to have ISR to do that. And the construct we use right now is everything that the Air Force provides is theater ISR, and it gets handed out to everybody. And so one of the things I did as a CFAC was designate certain platform as CFAC organic. If you have organic capability, you got all your own stuff, you bring it. So everybody else brings their organic stuff, and then they ask for the theater stuff. So they keep the organic stuff behind their back and have the theater stuff that they pull from. And so they come, every day, as I say, they were stealing our lunch money. We show up the next day and go, here's some more theater ISR, they take it all, we never get any of it. So we started keeping some of it so we could actually use it to develop targets, so we could go do deliberate targets. If you've heard of Operation Tidal Wave, which is the oil strikes up around the middle Euphrates Valley into Syria, as well as some of the strikes that we were doing just west of Mosul, those are driven by the CFAC. And you can't do that unless you have the ISR to develop the targets. And so we have to have a different approach as we do that. The other, let me look at my notes. I got maybe one or two other things I want to highlight. Kind of tied to that, and maybe in a broader perspective, is how do we actually articulate how we use air power? Okay, if you look at how we've executed over the past 16 years, it's troops in contact, close air support, stacked overhead, and it's almost you almost run into people because everybody's stacked there. But how do you actually talk about the effective air power? And the thing I see now is that we want to bring in either HIMARS or additional artillery, or we ask for very specific platforms, like I want an A-10. Well, that JDAM doesn't care whether it's on an A-10, a B-52, a B-1, or a Harrier. Okay, my DCFAC said we ought to do a JDAM taste test and be on the ground with a JDAM fall and figure out which airplane it came off of. It doesn't really matter, particularly when you're doing precision guided munitions. So we got to talk about how we do air power and how we articulate how we use that air power as we move forward. Also tied to that is how we develop targets. And that's something I think we as an Air Force have kind of dropped the ball on over the past 15 years, partly because of how we operate. And that was a challenge as I came in as a CFAC, partly because you can't develop, we were really tied to developing deliberate targets with FMV. When I came in the Air Force, we didn't have FMV. So we can develop targets without FMV. It's a proven fact. And we got to be prepared to do that, because when we get into a high-end fight, you're not going to have FMV over the target so you can watch it get struck. We're going to strike it and keep moving. And so we got to have a different approach from that regard. The last thing is, as you look and develop joint leaders, and one of the goals I know General Goldfein has is that the Air Force leads the JTF. And the only way we're going to be able to do that is if we put more officers into joint jobs and lead them there. And again, I'm a product of that. So the more joint experience you have, and I think the other piece tied to that is how we present forces to do a JTF. The Army and Marine Corps have organizations that have big staffs, divisions and corps, those kinds of things, that can actually go forward and become a JTF, pull them off the shelf. We don't have that. So we got to think through that as an Air Force on how we do that. All right. So let me stop there and start taking some questions.